Have you ever wondered if the most German place in your family story was never Germany at all, but an American town your relatives stopped talking about? What if the reason that old surname sounds half familiar, half erased, is because an entire culture was once everywhere in the United States and then taught itself to disappear? Before we go deeper, do me one quick favor. Like this video if you love hidden history, subscribe if you want stories that make the map feel personal, and share this with the one family member who still keeps the old names, the old photos, or the old questions alive. If your family came from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, or the hill country of Texas, this story may not feel distant at all. It may feel uncomfortably close, because this is not just a video about immigration. It is a video about memory, about what a country keeps, what it buries, and how millions of people can inherit a past without realizing they are carrying it. German Ancestry is one of the largest ancestry groups in the United States. That fact by itself is already surprising to many people, but the real surprise is not the size, it is the geography. German Ancestry is not spread across America in a soft, even blur. It forms a belt, a powerful visible band stretching from Pennsylvania through the Midwest and into the Great Plains, with one dramatic extension deep into Texas. In some of those places, German settlement became so dense, so rooted, and so socially complete that whole counties felt less like random American frontier land and more like transplanted pieces of Central Europe. And then, almost unbelievably, much of it vanished from the surface. Not from the bloodline, not from the records, not from the church books, cemetery stones, food, farm patterns, town names, or family trees, but from daily speech, from public identity, from the way descendants describe themselves. That is the first tension in this story. German America became enormous, but it also became quiet. Maybe quieter than any ethnic story this large has a right to be. To understand why, you have to begin with a question that sounds simple and turns out to explain almost everything. Why these states? Why not all of America equally? Why does German ancestry cluster so heavily in certain places, while other states, even large and wealthy ones, never became deeply German at all? The answer begins with timing, land, religion, and something historians do not always say clearly enough. Immigrants rarely move like scattered raindrops. They move like magnets. One village writes to another. One church sponsors another family. One cousin buys land and sends word back. One group settles, survives a hard winter, and suddenly the next ship does not feel like a leap into darkness. It feels like a route. The earliest large German settlements in what became the United States took shape in colonial Pennsylvania. That mattered more than it sounds. William Penn's colony offered religious toleration at a time when many German-speaking people in Europe were exhausted by pressure, hierarchy, and old conflict. Mennonites, Quakers, Lutherans, Reformed believers, and other communities found a place where they could build, farm, worship, and stay together. Germantown, founded in the 17th century, became more than a settlement. It became proof that German-speaking families could cross the Atlantic, survive, and remain connected to one another in a new world. That first success created a pattern. Later, migrants did not have to imagine America from scratch. They could aim for a known place, then move outward from it. The second great force was the huge 19th century wave. Between the 1830s and the end of the century, millions of German-speaking migrants left Europe. Some were driven by economic pressure, some by failed harvests, some by the revolutions of 1848 and the political disappointment that followed. Some wanted religious freedom, some wanted land. And for farming families, land was everything. The American Midwest and Great Plains did not just offer opportunity in the abstract. They offered acreage, soil, and the possibility of building a future in communities made up of people who spoke a familiar language and prayed in familiar ways. That is why the map matters. German settlers kept moving westward, but not randomly westward. They moved along routes where transportation was possible, where land policy made settlement realistic, and where earlier German communities had already planted the first anchors. Pennsylvania fed Ohio. Ohio fed Indiana and Illinois. The movement continued into Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas. The result was not just immigration, it was replication. Churches, newspapers, schools, breweries, farming networks, singing societies, mutual aid groups, and tightly bound rural neighborhoods appeared again and again. For a while, this culture was not hidden at all. It was public, loud, organized, self-confident. You could hear German in churches, in homes, in local business districts, in lodge halls, in schoolrooms, and in newspapers. You could see it in architecture, in food traditions, in the names of streets and local festivals, and in the rhythms of everyday life. In city neighborhoods and farming counties alike, German identity was not some private detail tucked away in a family Bible. It was a living social world. Then came the break. When the United States entered the First World War, German identity changed overnight from ordinary to suspicious. The country's largest ancestry group suddenly found itself linked in the public imagination to the enemy. That shift was brutal. German language newspapers closed. German instruction in schools was restricted or banned in many places. Communities stopped advertising what they had always been. Families changed the way they pronounced names or changed the names themselves. Churches shifted to English. Parents who had grown up bilingual decided not to pass the language to their children, partly to protect them, partly to make life easier, partly because fear has a way of disguising itself as practicality. This is one of the deepest emotional currents in the entire story. The disappearance was not natural in the slow, peaceful sense people often imagine when they talk about assimilation. A lot of it was pressured. A lot of it was strategic. A lot of it happened because people understood very quickly that being visibly German in wartime America could cost them social standing, safety, trust, and sometimes even livelihood. So when you look at an American county today and find thousands upon thousands of people with German ancestry but very little German language left, you are not looking at a weak heritage. You're looking at a heritage that survived by going underground. And that is exactly why these states are so fascinating. They preserve the footprints even when the voice is gone. Start with Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is where the story first becomes visible in America. When people hear the phrase Pennsylvania Dutch, many assume it points to the Netherlands. It does not. The word came from Deutsch, German. The communities that built this culture were German-speaking, and they created one of the most distinctive regional identities in the United States. Lancaster and the surrounding counties still carry that imprint in plain-dressed traditions, church communities, barn styles, dialect echoes, and foods that only make sense once you know the deeper background. But Pennsylvania matters for another reason, too. It was the launch platform, the proof that German-speaking settlers could arrive early, survive, expand, and create stable communities over generations. If Pennsylvania had failed, later migration might have looked very different. Instead, it became the first great base camp of German America. Now move west, because this is where the numbers become almost shocking. Wisconsin is often the first state that forces people to rethink what they know. In popular imagination, Wisconsin is dairy country, beer country, cold winters, Green Bay, small towns, and practical people. But under that familiar American image is one of the strongest German settlement stories in the nation. By the 19th century, cities like Milwaukee were transformed by German-speaking immigrants who did not merely arrive there. They built civic life there. Breweries, social clubs, theaters, newspapers, churches, gymnastic societies, workers' associations, and family businesses made German culture feel not marginal but central. That matters because culture becomes harder to erase when it has institutions. A family can lose a language in one generation. A city shaped by thousands of families leaves deeper marks. Even if the language fades, the surnames remain. The architecture remains. The beer legacy remains. The neighborhood patterns remain. The old cemeteries remain. In Wisconsin, the German story is still visible even when people no longer name it. And Wisconsin is not alone. North Dakota and South Dakota take the story in a different direction, and maybe a more surprising one. Because many of the German families who settled there were not arriving directly from Germany at all. They were Germans from Russia, descendants of people who had moved eastward into the Russian Empire generations earlier under promises of land, religious freedom, and exemption from military service. For a long time, they preserved German language, customs, and faith in Russian territory. Then the conditions changed. Privileges were reduced, pressures increased, and many of those communities left again, this time for America. If this is your kind of story, stay with me all the way through, because the second half gets even more personal. Tap subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment with your family's home state, because I want to know which part of this map still lives in your story. When those German-Russian families reached the northern plains, they did something very important. They did not dissolve into the landscape. They clustered. They built towns, parishes, and farming communities where language, marriage, worship, and memory reinforced one another. That is why parts of North Dakota and South Dakota can feel almost unbelievable in ancestry data. Not just high German presence, but very high concentration. In some counties, the share of residents claiming German roots became so large that the local culture felt shaped by one migration stream more than by a dozen smaller ones. And notice what that means. The title of this video is not really saying these states are politically part of Germany, of course. It is saying something more interesting. In many regions of Germany itself, identity has always been mixed by local differences, internal migration, and war. But in parts of rural America, certain immigrant communities reproduced themselves with remarkable density. They froze pieces of a cultural world, then carried them forward together. In that sense, some American places became more uniformly German by ancestry than many places in modern Germany are today. That is a strange sentence, but it helps explain why this story grabs people so hard. America did not just absorb Germans. In certain states, Germans helped build the social backbone of the place. Nebraska is a perfect example of that backbone effect. By the early 20th century, German communities in Nebraska were not a minor feature. They were woven into town life, farming life, and church life. Migration moved along transportation corridors and fertile land, especially through areas tied to westward routes. Families stopped where land was workable, where neighbors spoke familiar words, and where congregations could be built quickly. Over time, the result was a lattice of German-descended rural communities so thick that in many counties the ancestry pattern still stands out clearly more than a century later. Iowa tells a similar story, but with its own flavor. Eastern Iowa, especially along river-linked settlement zones, developed old and rooted German communities, early enough that later arrivals could plug into something already stable. That matters. Early settlers make later settlement easier. They reduce risk. They create churches, businesses, and trust networks. And once that happens, immigration stops feeling like isolation and starts feeling like reunion. Minnesota expands the picture again. In some parts of Minnesota, German settlement shaped both cities and countryside. Urban neighborhoods absorbed craftsmen, merchants, laborers, and brewers. Rural counties absorbed Catholic and Lutheran families who wanted land, but also wanted structure, ritual, and continuity. What survives now is not always obvious to the casual visitor, but names, parish histories, cemetery inscriptions, and the very pattern of small-town life still reveal how deeply German roots once ran there. Kansas adds one of the most consequential chapters of all, because this is not just a story about who lived where. It is also a story about what they changed. German-Russian settlers helped bring agricultural knowledge and crop traditions suited to harsh plains conditions. The spread of hard winter wheat transformed the possibilities of farming in Kansas and helped reshape the economic future of the state. Think about that for a moment. This is one of the recurring truths of immigration history. People do not only bring bodies, they bring methods, seeds, tools, habits, recipes, building styles, and ways of surviving climates that other people misread. That is why ancestry stories matter when they are told properly. They are not just sentimental, they are structural. They explain why a region grows the crops it grows, builds the churches it builds, and talks the way it talks. Ohio brings yet another side of the German-American story into focus. If the Northern Plains show how German communities could dominate rural settlement, Ohio shows how German-speaking immigrants shaped urban culture. Cincinnati became one of the most famous German-influenced cities in America, so much so that whole districts carried unmistakable marks. But Ohio also reminds us that immigration is never just demographic. It is ideological. Many of the German migrants who came in the 19th century, especially the political refugees after 1848, carried powerful convictions about freedom. They were not passive passengers in American history. They argued, organized, voted, published, and helped shape public life. That matters because it breaks a lazy stereotype. German Americans were not only farmers in isolated townships or brewers in urban enclaves. They were also thinkers, reformers, craftsmen, soldiers, clergy, merchants, editors, and activists. The story is bigger than ethnicity. It is about how one migration stream entered nearly every layer of American development. And then there is Texas, which feels at first like it should not belong on this list at all. That is exactly why it is so memorable. When people picture German America, they usually imagine snow, brick churches, Midwestern fields, or Pennsylvania valleys. They do not imagine the Texas Hill Country. But Fredericksburg and the surrounding region preserve one of the most distinctive stories in the country. 19th century migrants from different German states helped establish communities that stayed unusually self-aware and durable. And, for a long time, unusually linguistic. German was not just something remembered there, it was spoken. In some places, a local Texas German dialect survived well into the modern era. Think about how extraordinary that is. A form of German carried across an ocean, planted in central Texas, and preserved long enough for linguists to study it generations later. That is not a footnote. That is one of the great cultural plot twists in American history. Here is the bigger pattern connecting all of these states. They were not just places Germans passed through. They were places Germans could own, organize, and reproduce. Good farmland mattered. Affordable land mattered. Religious freedom mattered. Transportation routes mattered. But equally important was social density. Once a migration stream becomes dense enough, it stops feeling like immigration and starts feeling like home. That is why some of these states became more German in everyday life than outsiders realize. Not because every resident was German, not because the landscape literally copied Germany, but because the local institutions, family networks, churches, dialects, and school habits were heavily shaped by German-speaking settlers. And then the silence after World War I made that success harder to see. If you step back and look at the map now, it starts to feel less like a set of state borders and more like a memory trail, stretching from old Pennsylvania settlements through the Farm Belt and all the way into Texas. And once you understand that silence, you start noticing strange things all over the country. A county packed with German surnames, but hardly anyone saying they grew up with the language. A church founded by German settlers, but services long ago shifted into English. A family recipe with a name nobody can pronounce anymore. A grandparent who says, almost casually, that the old surname used to be different. An old trunk with letters no one can read. These details matter because they reveal how total the transition was. The United States did not forget German influence because the influence was small. It forgot because the people carrying it adapted quickly. The more successful assimilation became, the less visible the original story looked to later generations. That creates a strange irony. The most common ancestry can become one of the least emotionally understood. People know they may be part German, but they often do not know what that meant on the ground. They do not know which wave their family came in. They do not know which church tradition shaped them, whether their ancestors came from German states or from German settlements in Russia. Whether the surname was changed, or whether their town once had a German-language newspaper 2 blocks from where they now buy coffee. This is where the story becomes personal even for viewers with no immediate interest in genealogy. Because hidden ancestry is really a story about how identity works in modern life. Most people do not inherit the full truth. They inherit fragments, a dish at Christmas, a last name, a joke about thrift, a certain kind of bread, a story about a farm. A church affiliation nobody questions. A town cemetery full of repeated names. The deeper explanation often disappears first. If this is unlocking something for you, pause for 1 second and back this channel in a way that actually helps. Like the video, so more people find it, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and share it with the relative who says we should look into history. And when it disappears, people start imagining that assimilation was effortless. But it rarely was. Every lost language represents a decision. Every name change hides a pressure. Every family that stops teaching its children the old words is responding to something. Whether fear, ambition, exhaustion, or the simple desire to belong without resistance. That is why German-American history deserves more attention than it usually gets. It shows what happens when a group becomes so numerous and then so thoroughly absorbed that the culture remains everywhere in evidence but nowhere in speech. Look again at Wisconsin, the brewing tradition, the surnames, the parishes, the civic clubs. Look at the Dakotas and the concentration of German-Russian communities. Look at Nebraska's church networks and farming counties. Look at Iowa's rooted settlements. Look at Minnesota's Catholic and Lutheran strongholds. Look at Kansas agriculture. Look at Cincinnati and Ohio, where German influence shaped music, politics, neighborhood life, and public culture. Look at Pennsylvania, where the first great German-speaking settlements helped define the pattern for everything that followed. Look at Texas, where an entire dialect managed to survive on the frontier. This is not thin influence, it is foundational influence. And yet, what do many descendants feel today? Usually something vague. They know the family came from somewhere over there. They know a name changed or a recipe survived. They know there was a farm, maybe a church, maybe a grandmother who understood more than she spoke. But they often do not know how close the past still is. If you took a drive through the counties most shaped by German settlement, you might not hear much German now. But you would still be moving through its consequences. Through fields planted on patterns made possible by those settlers, through towns built around churches they founded, through cultural habits so normalized that people no longer realize they came from anywhere specific. That is part of what makes this title true in a deeper sense. Some American states are more German than most of Germany, not because they are frozen museums, but because they preserved concentrated communities. Germany went through empire, unification, border shifts, war, and mass modern mobility. Meanwhile, in parts of rural America, descendants stayed rooted. The result is not a perfect replica. It is something stranger, a cultural echo that became local, American, and yet still recognizably German in its bones. And once you see that, you start understanding why family records in these states can be so powerful. A church register in Kansas may connect to a village pattern in Europe. A cemetery in Nebraska may reveal migration chains. A county atlas in Wisconsin may place dozens of German-born households next to each other in ways that tell you who followed whom. A parish book in the Dakotas may show the persistence of a community that crossed not one border, but 2. First into Russia, then into America. This is why descendants often feel such a shock when they start looking. The records are not abstract. They are intimate. Suddenly, the past stops being German ancestry as a category and becomes your people. And even if you never search a single archive, the map alone tells a dramatic story. It tells you that the American heartland was shaped in major part by German-speaking settlers. One of the strongest forces later became the quietest. It tells you that silence is not the same as absence. Maybe that is the real reason this topic hits so hard. Everyone understands what it means to inherit something half erased, a name you cannot pronounce, a language that ends with a grandparent, a place your family once came from but stopped naming. German America is that feeling on a massive scale. So if your roots run through Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, or the Texas Hill Country, treat it as a clue. Because there is a good chance your family story is part of one of the largest and most forgotten cultural transformations in American history. And even if your family comes from somewhere else entirely, this story still matters, because it changes the way you see the United States itself. It reminds you that regions are not just shaped by state lines or political myths. They are shaped by people who arrive in waves and build institutions. Before we finish, I want to leave you with one more thought. If this made you think about your family in a new way, remember that feeling. Because that small spark of curiosity is often how a lost story starts coming back. In the end, this is not really a story about how German some American states became. It is a story about building a sturdy world, then losing the public language of that world within a generation or two. The churches remain, the farms remain, the town grids remain, the recipes remain, the cemeteries remain, the family faces remain. Sometimes even the dialect survives, hanging on in the last voices of a place like the Texas Hill Country. But the self-understanding fades, and people begin to live inside the results of history without knowing whose hands made them. That is why this subject feels bigger the longer you sit with it. It is about migration, reinvention, pressure, forgetting, pride, and survival. It is about how a people can become completely American without ever fully ceasing to be what they were. And it is about how the map keeps secrets long after memory gives up. So the next time you hear an American surname in Wisconsin, drive past a church in Nebraska, or see a wheat field in Kansas, remember this. The story did not vanish. It just got translated into the landscape. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. For millions of Americans, Germany is not only a country across the ocean, it is a hidden layer under home, a buried accent under everyday speech, a missing chapter in the family story. And in some states, that buried layer is so deep and so widespread that it still shapes the place more powerfully than most people notice. The map remembers, the towns remember, the records remember. And if your family came from one of these states, there's a very real chance that somewhere behind the ordinary version of your last name is a much older story, waiting for someone to ask the question that brings it back.